Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Connie's Corner. I'm Constance, and I have another review for you guys today. So, last weekend, I got to go see Come From Away. I want to give a little context, my rapid, non spoiler thoughts, just in case you haven't seen it and you are just looking for reviews. And then we'll get into the good stuff because that's why people really click on reviews, right? So, very spontaneous decision. Just a couple weeks ago, my daughter was like, "Oh, I really want to see Come From Away," and we have a lot of shows lined up that we want to see to make up from all the not seeing shows during COVID. I mean, truth be told, I want to see everything, but you got to triage this, right? You can't see everything. Well, maybe you can see everything. Maybe if you live in New York or within reasonable driving distance to New York, you can see almost everything in a given time span of your life. But most of us have to pick and choose, and it's very hard to pick and choose. So, for those of you who don't know what Come From Away is, it based on the remarkable true story. Now, that's not hyperbolic. That this story actually is pretty remarkable, all things considered. What is it about? If you don't know anything about it, what I would say is it's about a community that comes together during a global crisis, and it shows the good side of humanity. It shows that not everything about being human is all gloom and doom, because as we've learned, the more we exist on this planet, everyone acts like it's brand new information, but it's not. There are some really bad people. There are bad policies, people who get power hungry and drunk with their power and make the rest of our lives difficult because they don't think about the greater good. We know this. This is known just in your daily life. If you exist at all, there are all these things, the system, right, that hurts you, or these bad people. We know this. You don't really need more entertainment going on and on about how awful people are or the system is or society, what have you. It is so refreshing to have a story. This is a very uplifting story. This is a happy story. Happy being a loose term. You walk out of here feeling good. Now, that's the explanation you should get. If you don't know anything else about Come From Away, check it out for yourself if you're able to. It is on Apple TV. So if you can't physically go to the show, which is what I always push for you to do, watch it on Apple TV. It's not the same experience, but it's better than nothing. Okay. But that's not the definition I got. When I heard this title for the first time, I'm like, oh, what's that? I always like to look up what a show is. The quick synopsis is people go, it's 9/11, the musical, which is a terrible way to describe this show. When you think 9/11, you think of one thing, or you probably think of several things, but they're not positive. And then when you think musical, you definitely think these two things are like water and oil. They should not be mixed together. So only knowing that little soundbite, I thought, well, I don't need to see that. I'm not interested in material that is in any way exploitive. Um, this is not long enough ago where everyone involved who is still with us is now long dead. People, families and loved ones of victims of that day are still with us. It's just too close. And so I thought, what a terrible idea for a musical. But you have to dig a little deeper than that, which is what we're going to do. So before I get into my spoiler thoughts on what this show is, I just wanted to clarify that because that kept me from almost seeing this show. If my kid hadn't suggested it, I would have let this pass me by, and that would have been a mistake. So let me tell you why. First of all, it's a very tight show. Like Six, it's a one-act musical. It's very fast-paced. It definitely is the kind of show where once they start, you got to pay attention. You got to really listen to them. There are no breaks. It's just a nonstop thing. So it's brisk. That's the word I kept using as I was trying to describe this to people who haven't seen it. But I think that's a good thing. It's a minimal set. The set doesn't change. They have 12 actors and 2 tables and 12 chairs. And they just rotate them around to simulate that they're in different places. This is a show that does not have a full orchestra. It actually has a smaller band, and they are up on stage with them. So the set itself, it has a lattice like brick looking wall. It changes. Like when you first see it, you just think it's a brick wall, but then it changes as the show changes to help simulate where we are, that time is going by and all that stuff. So sometimes it looks like the sky, sometimes it looks like a wall, sometimes it does look like the side of airplanes or buildings. they only have a few things on the set to simulate where we are. So to me, this is true theater, a real theater. Not that you can't have large, expensive sets, because I love all the set work, but true theater should rely heavily on its book. And even though scenery supports all that, you shouldn't rely on your scenery to do the storytelling for you. The story should do its own storytelling. And this is a show that's about the story. That is the paramount thing here. The costumes are very simple. Obviously, it's a contemporary piece, so everyone's just wearing jeans and t-shirts and recognizable clothing. It's not a period piece, so it's not really known for its clothing, but it's not about the clothing because they're supposed to look like everyday people. That's what's remarkable about the story. So what it's actually about, on that day, a lot happened. A lot happened. There are so many untold stories. We haven't even scratched the surface because we've done the big ones. We know all about New York. We know about Washington, D.C. We even know quite a great deal about United 93 in Pennsylvania. All important. They deserve all the coverage. And of course, we've seen things from Mayor Giuliani's point of view and the president's point of view, and just us as a nation, we're all lumped together. But this was a global disaster. It happened on US soil, but it's a very international story. So this is talking about the fact that, as you may recall, if you were there on the planet that day, or if you've researched it, if you weren't on the planet that day, one of the remarkable things about it was, as soon as we understood what was going on, the FAA demanded that all planes land. It wasn't about finishing your flight out. It was like, the closest airport you're to, you're going down right now. Never happened. I mean, we're talking thousands of planes. So there was a lot of planes going over the Atlantic Ocean at the time. You know, it was your typical morning, heavy traffic air lanes going on. And so there was an airport in Newfoundland, Canada. Now, apparently there was debate about whether or not to keep this airport going, because the airport was founded to help planes get across the Atlantic Ocean, because the ocean's so wide that you couldn't do it in one shot when planes were first invented. So that was a good place in the middle to refuel to get you the rest of the way. Well, obviously, as technology advanced, planes got better, so you didn't need this airport. So thankfully, the airport still existed. So what does it say? About 38 planes landed in Newfoundland. So there's that famous imagery of all the planes on the tar mats. And it's about how these tiny little communities in Canada, mostly Gander, but surrounding areas as well, suddenly all pitched in, because they couldn't just sit there and watch what was happening in New York and DC and the like and do nothing. Here they were suddenly thrown all these passengers, and they felt this call to arms of, what do we have to do to make these people who are suddenly stranded not feel so stranded? How can we make them comfortable until they're allowed to go home? So it's a fast-paced musical because it covers the 5 days that people were stranded there. They had to get supplies, they had to deal with all kinds of things that you wouldn't think of until you really start to tease it out. There were animals on those planes. How are we dealing with those? There are babies on the plane. How are we dealing with that? All sorts of stuff. I mean, it's just, when you think about, if it had to be you who solved this problem and deal with this situation, what would you do in this crisis? So what's great about the story, it's the uplifting story about how everyone was just pouring their heart out to these, tumbleweeds of people, and inviting them into their homes, letting them shower, letting them sleep there, cooking all this food, having so much food that they actually had to close the hockey rink and make it a refrigerator because so much food was being shipped to these places, right? Now, the show deals with the tragedy of the day, but it's not in your face. It's not like they show all these images that could be a trigger. So if you are sensitive to all things 9/11, I think you could handle this show because it's not so in your face. And it's about something that was also happening that day that was also a big event, but it's so removed from the tragedy of what we know of the day, right? I think it handles the subject matter very delicately with a very skilled hand. So if you're like me, where you were going to write this off going, oh, I don't need to see a musical about 9/11, it's not what you think. Because it's about this whole other thing that was going on that was also pretty traumatic and actually quite huge, but it's uplifting. the whole goal, I believe, of this show is to leave you feeling better about how humans are. Because even though some awful people out there did a horrible thing that day, I mean, catastrophically awful, think about how nice everyone was. Like, think about September 12th is the better way to view this. This is about September 12th. How did the world come together and we were all there for each other, right? So I delayed my review in this because I read reviews just because I wanted to see what the people feel like. This, in some ways, this show is a critical darling, but in other ways, people hate that this exists. They do think it's exploitive. But the creators of the show, they are a married couple from Canada. Let's see, Irene Sankoff and David Hein. I mean, they did their homework. This was like an 8-year project. They didn't just whip it out. They went to Newfoundland, they went to Gander, they interviewed a lot of people. Everything that you see on stage in the show is a composite of real stories from the people that were there that day. So it's all there, and it's so stripped down and so minimal and yet so brisk. But I think part of that is to help evoke what it felt like to be on the planet at that time. You know, the information was coming at you really fast, but also you had to wait and you had to wait. So there was a lot of waiting around. But that doesn't stop your mind from having all these questions, and you're full of fear. It talks about how afraid everyone was, and how lost we all felt. I mean, it really does harken to that. So I think you'll have your own memories of that day. Again, if you were alive and conscious, like old enough to comprehend what 9/11 was. And if you weren't there, I think this is a very good illustration to evoke, if you weren't there, this is what it was like. But we're going to focus on what's good about humans. Okay. So before I get into the spoilers of it all, I do want to point out, let's see. So, okay. So here's like the cast list. Really pay attention to how they're listed here. Oh, let me hold that right. So if you look here, you have your standard cast list, but look at the standbys and look at how they list a person and they're like, these are all the parts they play. This is a show where everyone has to know everyone else's part because nobody plays a single character. They wanted to honor so many stories that they try to cram as many in here as possible. Now, that doesn't mean it's like packed so full that none of it has any meaning. They're just trying to show that no one is the star. No one is the star. This is the truest form of ensemble storytelling that you'll ever get. So if you don't like shows that should be about a group of people because they always push one person forward so they could be our point of view character, or we got to have someone be our protagonist, this is a good show. And this is also a good example of what it means to be an understudy. I read an article recently in Page Six about people being mad that they pay all this money to see a show on Broadway and then they see the understudies. Like, that's such a bad thing. Understudies work harder, I would argue, than your A-list talent because they need to know like 8 or 9 different parts at any one time. That way, no matter who calls, they can step in on a moment's notice. Usually people are not an understudy for a single role in a single show. That's not very smart from a money standpoint. It's in their best interest to know as many parts as possible. Now, with a show like this, because there's so many characters and everyone's playing more than one person already, well, then your standbys need to know all the parts. So it's, if you're in Come From Away, if you're an actor looking for a show, this would be a good acting exercise because you just have to know everything. That's a lot. That is huge. And it's so well choreographed. And I don't really mean from a dancing standpoint. I just mean from we're switching everything and we're switching. They put jackets on, take them off, and that's just all they're doing to show that there's someone different. It's really quick. It's amazing. It is like watching a dance, but they're not actually dancing. And the band that they have on stage, I started to say this, but I forgot. It's not a full orchestra, but it's instruments that are indigenous to Canada. And when they first started playing, it was very Irish, very Celtic sounding. And I had no idea that Newfoundland had a huge Celtic background. I would not have pegged that, as they were talking, they have very thick accents in the show, obviously to signify where they are in the world. And I'm like, wow, this is very Irish. I would not have guessed. When I think Canada, I think French because so much of Canada was occupied, owned by France. I guess I don't really know my history. If you like Celtic music, you should go just to hear this band play. Oh my goodness, they have fiddles and an accordion, and they joke in the show about an ugly stick. I guess that's a real thing. I'm not a musician. I don't know. So from a live music standpoint, I do also recommend the show for that. Love the live music. It's so good. So good. So stripped down. It's not about the set, it's not about the costumes, it's about the stories, because these are real people during a huge global event. So it's about coming here and honoring that. If that sounds like something for you, check it out. Go see it in person if you can. It's touring right now. That's how I saw it. It just happened passing by. This was very last minute. We got tickets. I don't regret a thing. We found a new theater that we like. So we have more options. And I learned I shouldn't judge a book by its cover. You can't just say it's 9/11 the musical and give that to people to make a decision whether or not to see it. There's so much more to it than that. So go see it. If you can't, if it's not coming anywhere near you, it's currently on Apple TV as of taping in this review. You get a free week trial if you don't have Apple TV. I think it's worth checking out. Now, I did watch it because they talk so fast. I was worried that, and the show was really funny. There's a lot of jokes in this show. And my audience loved it. We laughed and we laughed. And I was worried that I missed things. I didn't miss as much as I thought I did. When I watched it again on Apple TV, I was like, oh, okay, thank God. I didn't miss stuff. So I did not know there was a pro shot available. After I saw the show, I came home and I quickly did research because I wanted to make sure I had an informed review for you guys. And that's how I discovered that it was on Apple TV. So I'm telling you, it's not the same thing as being in the room, but it's actually a very good pro shot. It's the majority of the original Broadway cast. They filmed it after the shutdown was starting to lift on Broadway. So it was one of the first shows to come back. It has since closed on Broadway, but it did come back in 2021. So it's most of the original cast members. It's a very good pro shot. You can watch Apple TV for free for a week. I can't recommend it enough. So those are my rapid fire, non-spoilery, as much as you can't spoil what this is, because you got to tell people enough about it. But now we'll get into more spoilery things. Yeah, so it's brisk, and that's good and bad. It's good because I think it illustrates just how hectic that time period was so that you could feel it. But it breaks a lot of musical theater rules. Now, the creative team, the husband and wife who wrote this show, they did that on purpose. They used film language more than theater language. And that's another criticism that people who don't like the show throw at it. They're like, well, it doesn't have the traditional musical theater narrative. No, but that is done on purpose. And before I criticize a thing, I always look for director or creator intent. What was their intent? If they said, well, we did that on purpose, well, then they achieved it. You can't criticize something that they were aiming for. It's just not what you would want. A big example of this is the songs. They don't like do a song and then at the end they have a little ha and hold it waiting for applause. You want to clap, but they move right into the next thing. Like they don't really slow down. They don't take breaks. So it's hard to clap during the show, and you want to acknowledge like, oh, that was a good job. I want to applaud that. But they're like, next thing, next thing, next thing. So I don't know if this is to the show's detriment. In their strive to acknowledge as many of the people from this experience as possible, maybe they have sacrificed some theater conventions like, let's have a song, pause for applause, and then move on to another section. I think they're just so consumed with the story element that they are willing to forgo what we're used to in the theater. It's very different vibe-wise and structure-wise. It's weird. Before I saw Six, I had never seen a one-act musical before, and now I've seen two. It's weird. They were like, there's no intermission. This is like a 100, no, it's not that short. It's an hour and 40 minutes or something like that. It's really short. It's funny, when I was at the theater, the people at the concession stands were all like, there's no intermission, get your snacks now. But I knew that much going in because it was far enough away where I had to make a plan. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think maybe they're more common than I'm aware of. I've never heard of musicals that were only one act. I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that hurts your time. If anything, you have more of a day to plan other things with it. Um, but I think with the way they wanted to tell the story, it works very, very well. So as much as I'm praising it, there are things about it I didn't like, but this is splitting hairs. Let me just be clear about that. So they do a mix of either it's the people of Gander and surrounding communities, but mostly Gander, or what they call the plain people. So people who are trapped on the plains, and then because they were apparently, depending on what plane we're talking about in relationship to what time they landed versus what time they got off, they had to sit on those planes for hours, maybe even for the first full day that they were there. So they didn't land and deplane. We didn't know what was going on. It was just happening so fast, and we didn't have the widespread news that we can give each other. Cell phones were in their infancy, like we had them, but not everyone really had one. Social media was in its infancy. You know, like you just got to remember, even though 2001 wasn't that long ago, it was actually long enough ago where we can sit here now going, oh yeah, if that same thing happened now, it would be very different. So they had to treat everything like a threat. They didn't know if there were bombs on those planes, so they were like, let's just leave them over there. This way they can't harm any more iconic buildings, because we didn't know if it was strictly an American tragedy in the beginning either. You know, London had to be afraid, and Paris and all these other places. It wasn't until some time went by that we were like, oh, okay, this was a very targeted thing. Here's the target. It's actually very finite. But we didn't know that at the time. So these poor people, they're trapped on the planes forever. So as they're depicting people, you know, they only pick a few people to be in the show to be a composite of real people. So they do have a gay couple in this show, which is not the problem. The problem with what they did was they came across as the comic relief, and I'm getting tired of that trope. It's two guys named Kevin. They're both named Kevin. That's a joke. It's really funny. They're funny. It's just I worry that the only reason they're there was to make us laugh. Like, oh look, here are the gays. Let's laugh at them. I don't know. You're already in danger of people poking fun at your show because you're dealing with such a serious subject matter. I don't know if you should also invite the whole let's play with representation, but in a careless way. It doesn't bother me, my own person, but I'm not part of that community. So when I think about that community, I look at that and go, well, I don't know, is this kind of not in bad taste? I think that's questionable. I would have done something different if it were me personally. Um, Now, some characters get a lot of extra attention. There is a character in this show who is a female pilot, and she is based on a real woman pilot. So we get to know her very, very well. And the mayor of Gander has a big role in this. So they're not the stars. We just get more stage time with them. So you get to know them better than some of the other people who just kind of come in, say one thing, and then they leave. It doesn't give you time to really feel for these people, because it's trying to keep that whole let's think about us as a group. So it's hard to get attached because they're moving so quickly. The characters themselves do come across a little one-dimensional. So if you like deep character pieces where you get to spend a lot of time in a character's head and really get to know them and see them have like this arc, you're not going to get that in this show. But again, that's not the intent. It's just a very different structure. It doesn't bother me. It was just so refreshing. It was so nice to see something different. And it's executed so well. I mean, you can't fault them for their technical prowess. I mean, it's crafted so very nicely. But I could see people not liking the show because they're like, well, you just didn't really get to know them. Like, oh, they're the gay couple. And like, that's it. Like, uh, we want more than that. But there just isn't time because that was the point. There's just so many people. How do you help them all? They did what they could, and everyone was grateful afterward. They had a beautiful 20-year anniversary celebration in Gander. So again, this show was heavily researched. They interviewed so many people, and there's a lot of footage about Newfoundland thanks to the musical bringing so much light. I mean, it's not like this was in the dark, but the musical is so popular. A lot of people like it. that now Newfoundland is kind of more on the map than it was September 10th of 2001. You know what I mean? So I think you have to appreciate the real world consequences of this show. You might fear, oh no, it's, you know, making people's tragedy into entertainment and that's disgusting and blah. I don't think that's what they're doing. I think if you go in with an open mind and realize what they're trying to do, you can appreciate for what it is. Does it have flaws? Well, of course, all shows do. Um, I think the flaws just don't outweigh what's good about it. Uh, Now, I said there's a lot of humor in this, and you might be thinking, humor in the 9/11 story? That's inappropriate. Not really. Humor is used to deflect all kinds of things, right? We accept that people use humor to get over bullying or to get over social hurdles. Like if you're a fat girl, like, oh, I can't be pretty, well, then I'll be funny. We accept comedy on those levels. This is a show where, yes, you could really dwell on what's sad about 9/11, but if you don't have any brevity, it's just going to be too hard to sit through. It's going to be too pulpy. And so you got to bring some humor. And it's not like it's jokey, jokey, ha ha. It really is just everyday people doing everyday things. And if you really pay attention to your friends and family, we do funny things every day. It's just silly little, oh, everyone does this. So it's relatable. So that's why you laugh because you get it. Um, there are some cultural things they do in the show that you might think, okay, that's not a good joke. That like they have a joke about someone who's fluent in Spanish and suddenly he does all this Latin inspired tropey stuff. It's funny, but if you think about it, you might go, well, yeah, is that cultural appropriation and it's being used for a cheap joke? Possibly. But I don't know. I don't know if the show is really asking you to think that deep. I think it's asking you to tune into what's human about us, what brings us together. How do we rise above such evil in the world? So if you're focusing on things like what I'm bringing up, like the LGBTQ representation and the caricatures of certain, indigenous peoples, it's not like you don't have a point. I just don't know how offensive it really is. So they do deal with death. There are characters who have loved ones in New York and they find out they die, and that's very sad. You can't ignore those things because they happened. They do have a character who I believe is from Egypt, but they're dressed in such a way where they come across as Islamic, and I think they are Islam. So it very briefly touches on the whole how people of a certain descent were treated during that time, because if you weren't of that descent, you were afraid of them. And it's a shame that that's our response, but that's how we are. You could take that with anything, like a serial killer. If they're after young women who are brunette and in their 20s, then young girls who are brunette and in their 20s are suddenly very fearful of any man that could be approaching them. You don't mean to do it, but as soon as you feel like you're a target because you're not a certain thing or because you are a certain thing, you do feel targeted. That is touched on. It's brief. Should they explore it more? Yes, in some media. 9/11 as a concept gets covered a lot. I don't think it's this show's responsibility to get into all that. I think the purpose of bringing those up at all is them acknowledging these are real things, these are real issues that happened at the time. We're just not going to ignore them. But we're not going to spend a lot of time on it either, because that's not the point of this show. There's just too many things you can talk about with this topic. You can't cover everything, certainly not in a one-act musical. I would say the music is very solid. A lot of people think it's generic and it all sounds the same. I don't agree with that. I think it's just as good as any other musical songs. Does it have a standout song? I've only heard the show 3 times. I did buy the soundtrack. Yes, I'm an 80s child. I like my physical media, whatever. I like the songs. Nothing jumps out at me yet. Parts of it are fictionalized, but so much of it, because of how tightly woven it is, they can't really make a lot of it up, which is the other reason why the traditional theater structure doesn't work, because this is not trying to tell you a traditional narrative. Real life doesn't have, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action. It's not nice and neat like that. They're trying to imitate how real life really works. So I don't know. I just think it's really well done. I am so grateful that my daughter at the last minute was like, "Oh, I really want to see it," and I was just like, "Oh, let's just see. Oh, it's going to be close to us in 2 weeks. Let's just go." We just did. I mean, that's just the best thing to do, really. It's just spontaneously go see stuff. Go see stuff. I recommend Come From Away. I think it does so much right. I understand if you don't like it or if you think it's too sensitive. I get that, but I suspect you'll be like me. If you gave it a chance, you would realize that you are wrong. it's not it's not too sensitive a topic for you. I think you can handle it. So those are my thoughts on this musical. I can't recommend it enough. And thank you for watching. I'll see you later. Bye.